Cheryl and I own a farm in Buckingham, Iowa, where we mainly grow corn. This was in August of 2018, on a slightly rainy night. I remember that night being one of those quiet, oppressive evenings. The humidity hung thick, and the rain had tapered off to a persistent, low mist, just enough to soak the corn leaves and turn the dirt driveway into a slick, dark mud. We were sitting in the living room. The TV was on, muted, showing some old rerun, and Cheryl was sketching out the budget for the coming winter. We were used to the quiet. The only sounds you normally hear out here are the wind moving through the corn, the low hum of the refrigerator, or maybe a distant coyote. That's what made the first sound so noticeable, even though it was subtle. It started sometime around 11:30 p.m. I was halfway through a cup of cold coffee, staring past the TV's reflection into the black pane of the window, when I heard it. A slow, rhythmic thump. Not loud, not sharp, but deep and dull, like someone dropping a heavy, wet sack onto soft ground. It was coming from the south end of our property, right where the main cornfield started, maybe a quarter mile away. I waited for the sound to repeat, trying to attribute it to something normal, a tractor cooling down, a branch breaking, a loose piece of siding. Nothing. Just the refrigerator humming. I dismissed it, took a sip of coffee, and went back to zoning out. Then, about 5 minutes later, it came again. This time, it was impossible to ignore, because it wasn't just a single sound. It was followed by a dragging noise, a wet, heavy shh, like something being pulled slowly through the damp earth, or maybe heavy canvas rubbing against itself. It was deliberate. It had a cadence. Cheryl didn't look up from her sketch pad. "You hear that, Mark?" she asked, her voice low and even. "Yeah." "What the hell is it?" She finally put the pad down, listening intently. The dragging sound had stopped, but the faint thump came once more, a little closer now. Maybe George is out on his combine trying to finish up a patch? No, wait, that doesn't sound like a machine. Too soft, and too rhythmic, I said, getting up and moving toward the kitchen window, which faced directly onto the field. It's too late for George. He's usually tucked in by 10. And I stood there for a good minute, watching the blackness. The mist made the yard light useless. It just cast a vague, milky glow that didn't penetrate the fields. The air felt colder now. I waited and listened. Nothing. Just the drip of water off the gutters. "Must be a deer," Cheryl suggested, walking up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist. She was trying to be the voice of reason, the skeptic, in a way. They can make some weird noises when they're moving through the high corn. Oh, I wanted to believe her. We'd lived here long enough to identify every animal sound, every mechanical groan, but that thump had been too heavy, too deliberate, too human. If it was a deer, why the drag? I murmured, my forehead pressed against the cool glass. It sounded like someone was lugging a body bag through the field, slowly. Cheryl tensed up behind me. "Don't say that. It's a farm, Mark. You're hearing things." I spent another 20 minutes trying to convince myself she was right, but the feeling of unease had already settled in. It was like I'd been given a warning, a faint, whispered clue that my safe, familiar environment was compromised. The vast, black cornfield, which usually represented our livelihood and stability, now felt like a huge, looming curtain hiding something terrible. We went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every few minutes, I'd sit up, expecting to hear the thump again. Around 1 a.m., the fear of the unknown finally outweighed the need for sleep. I quietly got out of bed, put on my old boots, and grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from the utility closet. "Where are you going?" Cheryl's voice was a low whisper in the dark. "Just need to check the south fence line," I lied. "Probably just a broken stake hitting the ground." She didn't argue, but her voice was tight. "Please, just be quick." I stepped out onto the porch. The air was a heavy, cold blanket. The mist had gotten thicker. The silence was absolute. No wind, no crickets, nothing. It was the kind of silence that feels dangerous. I turned on the flashlight. The beam was powerful, but the mist fractured it, turning it into a weak, pale cone. I walked the 100 yards down the driveway until I hit the edge of the field, where the corn stood like a solid black wall. I didn't see anything, so I started walking along the access road that runs parallel to the corn rows. I must have walked for 10 minutes, my senses on high alert, checking behind every cluster of stalks, looking for any sign of a deer, a stray piece of equipment, anything normal. I found nothing. I was about to turn back, chalking it up to a lack of sleep and an overactive imagination, when I heard it again. But this time, it was terrifyingly close. It wasn't the rhythmic thump this time. It was a single, wet snap, followed by the sound of something heavy and dense impacting the soft, recently tilled soil, less than 20 yards inside the field. It was definitely within our property line. I stopped dead still. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and the old adrenaline was kicking in, that primal fight-or-flight response. The problem with being a farmer is that you have a responsibility to your land. You can't just run away from a disturbance. I cautiously pointed the flashlight beam into the wall of corn. The beam only pierced a few feet before being swallowed by the dense, towering green stalks. But I heard something else, a low, ragged exhale, followed by a sound I recognized immediately. The soft, slow, deliberate patter of bare feet moving on wet soil. It wasn't running, it was walking. And it wasn't moving away from me. It was moving parallel to me, about 15 feet inside the corn, moving toward the house. I froze, the flashlight beam shaking wildly. The bare footprints confirmed my deepest fear. It wasn't an animal or a machine. It was someone. Someone deliberate, someone quiet, and someone who seemed to be stalking their way back toward my house, toward Cheryl. I dropped the flashlight. The sound of it hitting the mud felt deafening. In the sudden, total darkness, the sound of the bare feet stopped. The air hung still. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the presence of whatever was out there, completely concealed by the high corn. It was watching me, waiting. Then, from the spot where the sound had stopped, came a sound so deeply unsettling, I can feel the chill of it even now. A quiet, guttural click. It sounded like a tongue hitting the back of a pallet, or maybe a wet finger snapping silently, but it was aimed directly at me. It was a sound of recognition. I didn't think. I ran. I ran back toward the house, faster than I have ever run in my life, boots churning through the mud, the thought of Cheryl being alone in the house an agonizing spur. I burst through the back door, slamming it shut and throwing the deadbolt, my lungs burning. Cheryl was sitting up in bed, instantly awake. "Mark, what was that? You scared me to death." I couldn't speak for a moment, bent double, hands on my knees, trying to pull air into my lungs. There's someone out there, Cheryl," I finally gasped out. "In the corn, barefoot." They followed me back. I straightened up and looked at the kitchen window, the black glass now a perfect mirror reflecting my terrified, mud-splattered face. And in the very corner of that reflection, just a flicker, a movement where the yard light was bleeding into the field edge, I saw it. A quick, pale shape, too low to be a person standing, but definitely there, at the edge of the darkness, watching the house. Then I heard a new sound, coming from the porch, right outside the back door I had just locked. It was a slow, deliberate scrape. I didn't waste a second. I didn't grab my phone. I didn't reach for the shotgun, which was locked in the safe upstairs. I just grabbed the back of a kitchen chair and held my breath, staring at the door. Cheryl was already moving, but in the calm, measured way that always grounded me. She moved to the window next to the back door, the one that gave a limited view of the porch. She pulled the thick linen curtain back just an inch and pressed her eye to the crack. The sound continued. A slow, deliberate scrape, about 2 seconds of contact, a pause, and then another slow, heavy scrape. It wasn't the sound of metal on metal, or a key being tried in the lock. It was a damp sound. "What is it, Cher?" I whispered, my voice rough and barely audible. She didn't answer right away. Her breath hitched, a tiny, sharp intake of air. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaking, but still low. "Mark, it's dragging something." "No, wait. It's wiping its feet." "No, not wiping. It's like it's deliberately dragging its bare heel across the wood." The scraping stopped. We stood there, motionless, two statues in the dark kitchen. The only light came from the sliver of the moon filtering through the gap in the curtains and the indicator light on the microwave. The silence was back, but now it was a predator. Then, a new sound began, and this was worse than the scraping. It was a soft, steady squish, squish, squish. The sound of waterlogged bare feet stepping on the damp wood of the porch, and then moving onto the slick, muddy ground of the yard. It wasn't running. It was walking slowly, deliberately, not caring how much noise it made now. It was circling the house. Cheryl let the curtain fall, her face pale in the dim light. "It's moving to the side of the house, by the bedroom window," she said, her voice strained. "We need to call George." Now, we retreated to the living room, staying low, and I finally grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it trying to punch in George's number. He was the calm thinker, an old Marine. He wouldn't panic, but he'd take me seriously. He answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. "Mark? You okay? It's past 1. George, listen to me. Don't hang up," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I was out by the cornfield. There's someone out there, walking barefoot. They followed me back to the house. They're circling right now. I heard them on the porch." A heavy pause on the other end. George was processing the information, separating the facts from the adrenaline. "You sure, Mark? A vagrant? You see anything?" "No, I didn't see them clearly, but I heard them, George. The sound was... it was slow and deliberate. Not a panicked burglar. They dropped something heavy in the corn, and they were quiet until I saw them. They know we're here. They're right outside the window." As if on cue, a faint metallic clink came from the outside. Not loud, but clear. It came from the direction of the garage, where we kept the tools and old farming implements. "Did you hear that?" I hissed into the phone. "Yeah, I heard that. Hold on, Mark. Stay inside. Keep the doors locked. I'm grabbing my rifle and getting the truck. Give me 5 minutes. Don't do anything stupid." He hung up. I looked at Cheryl. She was already at the front window, peering out toward the long, dark driveway where George's old Chevy would soon appear. The weight was unbearable. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of the few dried leaves left on the oak tree sounded like a footstep. "Mark, look!" Cheryl pointed toward the back porch, which was partially visible through the kitchen door. The microwave light was reflecting off the area just outside the door. "When you ran in, you dragged mud everywhere. Look at the porch where you came in." I crept to the door and looked. On the outside wood deck, right where the scraped sound had been, there was an unmistakable streak. It wasn't the dark, gray-brown Iowa mud I had on my boots. This was a dark, reddish-brown smear that seemed thick and viscous. It was wide, too wide for a single foot, and it looked like it had been rubbed deliberately into the wood, like a crude painting. It was wiping something off its feet. My blood ran cold. The earlier image of the intruder dragging a heavy sack, the thump and ick flashed back. Was it mud? Or something worse? I didn't want to think about what the barefoot person might have been stepping in out in the field. We heard the roar of George's pickup engine starting up down the road, and the sound, usually so mundane, felt like salvation. The light of his truck quickly grew stronger, bouncing over the ruts in the dirt road as he sped towards us. I watched the side window, expecting the intruder to finally run, to vanish into the protective black shroud of the cornfield. But they didn't. Instead, as George's headlights washed over the front end of our truck parked in the driveway, and the light cut a massive, blinding swath across the side of the house, I saw it. It was just a flash, a fleeting image caught in the peripheral light, but I can still replay it frame by frame. Standing maybe 50 feet away, just inside the shadow line of the giant field oak, was a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, dressed in what looked like dark, ragged clothing, or maybe just caked in mud. Its hair was long and matted, but it wasn't the appearance that made me seize up. It was the way it was standing. It wasn't upright. It was bent, its head held unnaturally low, and its long, pale arms were extended in front of it, its hands barely dragging on the ground, almost like an ape. But the movement was slow, a deliberate, low-crawling gait. And then, as George's tires crunched on the gravel of the driveway, the figure did the most terrifying thing of all. It looked up. It looked directly at the house, at the window I was behind, and instead of fear or flight, it tilted its head sharply to the side. And from its throat came a new sound, one that had no place on a quiet Iowa farm in the middle of the night. It was a noise of recognition, not a threat, but an unsettling, almost childish humming. It was tuneless, an off-key, nasal drone that vibrated in the silent air, a sound of deeply deranged, almost peaceful contentment. It was singing. It was the humming of someone completely lost to sanity, but completely present in that moment, George's truck slammed to a stop outside. The figure, still humming, didn't run. It simply took one slow step sideways and melted into the dense, black wall of corn, the humming fading slowly until it was gone. I threw the door open, practically yanking George out of his truck. He was a sturdy man, always calm, but the look on my face was enough. "It's gone, George." It was right there. It was humming, George. Humming. I was shouting now, the adrenaline making my voice crack. We spent the next hour walking the perimeter with George's rifle, flashing the lights deep into the corn. We found nothing. No footprints on the driveway gravel. No sign of forced entry. George, the skeptic trying to stay grounded, tried to rationalize it. Maybe a kid, Mark. A runaway who's cracked up. There's some pretty sick stuff online these days, kids daring each other to do stuff. But I knew a dare didn't drag something heavy, and a dare didn't wipe dark, viscous smears on my porch. The next morning, with the sun high and the world back in order, George and Kenny came over. We walked into the cornfield where I dropped the flashlight. We found the flashlight, the batteries long dead. Near the spot where the wet snap had occurred, the corn stalks were bent and broken in a small, irregular circle. The ground was freshly disturbed. And there, pressed into the mud, were the unmistakable, deep imprints of large, bare feet. But the real find was 20 feet away. Tucked between 4 high stalks, as if placed there deliberately, was a small, perfectly peeled ear of corn. Every single kernel had been removed, not ripped, but carefully scraped away in a spiral pattern from tip to base. It was a bizarre, painstaking act of focus. We looked at the peeled corn, then at the empty field, and then at each other. Whatever had been out there wasn't a simple vagrant or a local prankster. It was someone broken, operating under a logic that was alien and terrifying. We never saw the figure again, but the psychological fear never left. Every August, when the corn gets high, I become obsessed. I check the locks 3 times, I never walk past the porch window after dark, and I find myself listening. Not for a thump or a drag, but for that sound of peaceful, deranged contentment. Last harvest, while running the combine, I found a small, hand-carved wooden doll tucked into the grain tank. It had no face, and its limbs were bent backwards. I didn't show it to Cheryl. I just burned it. And sometimes, when the house is silent, I go out to the porch and run my boot over the wood, over the faint reddish-brown stain that the sun and the rain never fully washed away. And I swear I can hear that slow, gentle, off-key humming in the distance, waiting for the corn to grow high again. The field calls back, and sometimes something answers. My name is Dale, and I used to work on a commercial pig farm in rural North Carolina. Not my farm. I was hired help, a farmhand. This was back in the spring of 2012. Hog farms are a special kind of awful, and I don't mean just the smell, which is a thick, humid curtain of manure, brine, and death that permanently clings to your clothes. I mean the noise. The constant, high-pitched, desperate screaming of thousands of pigs, day and night, is something that gets into your bones. It makes you feel like you're living on the edge of a panic attack all the time. The specific farm was owned by a guy named Earl, a tough, quiet man, the overreactor in our little dynamic. We were processing around 30,000 hogs a year in a huge, concrete complex of barns. The supporting character here was my coworker, Roy. Roy was the skeptic. Nothing fazed him. He'd seen every horror a farm could offer, and just washed it off with a hose and a shrug. The incident started, as these things always do, with something subtle. We were down in the south barn, the farrowing barn, where the sows give birth. It was a grim place, dimly lit, the air heavy with ammonia and the sound of sows grunting in pain. I was walking the inspection aisle, checking on the newly born litters, when I saw the note. It was taped to the wall of a farrowing crate, right at eye level, secured with a small piece of clear packing tape. This was strange. Farmhands don't leave notes. Everything is communicated over the radio or face-to-face. It was a piece of plain, white printer paper, and the message was written in blocky, black marker. "We need a new shepherd." I stared at it for a full minute, my mind instantly jumping to a joke. Maybe Roy was messing with me, but the handwriting wasn't Roy's usual sloppy scrawl. This was neat, uniform, almost mechanical. I peeled it off, folding it quickly and slipping it into my pocket. I didn't want Earl to see it. He was already stressed about the latest feed prices, and he would have just blown up at me for wasting time on a prank. Later that day, I showed it to Roy as we were cleaning out the muck pit. Roy, true to form, just scoffed. "Some idiot kid," he said, barely looking up from the shovel. "Probably a summer helper trying to be edgy." "Shepherd. It's a hog farm, Dale. We're pig feeders, not shepherds. Throw it out." I knew he was probably right. It was a little bizarre, but probably just a stupid, isolated incident. I burned the paper in the trash barrel that evening, trying to forget about it. The noise of the hogs seemed to swallow the whole episode, but the pigs themselves started to act weird. A few days after finding the note, the aggression levels in the fattening houses spiked dramatically. These pigs were already in close quarters, but now they were fighting more than usual, not just the typical jostling, but serious, bloody fights that required us to separate several hogs with our canes. That was annoying, but the really strange part was the sound. When pigs fight, they squeal and grunt, but a few times, while walking the catwalks above the feeding troughs, I would hear a sound that was different. It was a noise that sounded like one of the pigs was attempting a yell. A short, sharp burst of sound, too controlled, too human-like to be a natural hog sound. It was unsettling, like listening to a machine briefly malfunction into sentience. I was telling Roy about it one afternoon, when we heard the sound again, clear as a bell, coming from the center of the main barn. It was a quick, choked, "Wah!" Definitely not a squeal. Roy stopped what he was doing. He finally looked unsettled. "Okay, what the hell was that?" "I told you," I whispered, staring into the dark maze of the pig pens below us. "They're making a sound like they're trying to talk." We spent a tense 15 minutes searching that section of the barn. We checked every pen, every feeder, every corner. Nothing. Just pigs, thousands of them, pressing against the gates, their breath misting in the humid air. The screaming was back to normal, the grinding, mindless sound of hog life. Then, about a week later, the notes started appearing again. This time, they were more specific. The first one was found taped to a bag of sow feed. It was the same handwriting, the same blocky letters, but written in a dark, thick substance that I immediately recognized as dried hog blood. "The walls are thin." We hear the whispers. This wasn't a joke. This was actively disturbing. And this time, Roy didn't scoff. He stared at the note, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. "Dale, this isn't from a teenager. Who has access to dried blood and paper and is doing this? It had to be one of the other hands, but there were only 6 of us, and we all worked in pairs, always under Earl's watchful eye. It would have taken a moment of complete privacy and incredible stealth. We decided to keep it secret from Earl the overreactor because we knew he'd fire all of us and call the police, escalating the situation prematurely. We had to find the source. We were convinced it was a former worker, or maybe a disgruntled animal rights activist who had managed to breach the perimeter fence, though the farm was surrounded by thick woods and electric wire. That night, I started to feel the fear of being watched. The farm was remote, the barn complexes vast. The only light outside was a weak security floodlight that cast long, confusing shadows. I kept thinking about the notes, about the sheer effort and creativity it took to make them. As I was locking up the processing plant doors, the final task of the night, I noticed something on the concrete wall near the water spigot. It wasn't a note this time. It was a piece of charcoal, or maybe just mud, used to scrawl a crude, disturbing image. It was a drawing of a human figure. It was stick-thin, drawn in profile, and had a huge, exaggeratedly wide-open mouth. But the most chilling detail was that the figure's head was tilted at an impossible, sharp angle, just like a pig's snout is often held when it's rooting or eating. The whole thing looked like a human trying to mimic a pig's posture. Beneath the drawing, in the familiar block letters, was the final part of the message that night. "We've set a place for you. The feast is ready." I stood there for a long time, the stench of the nearby anaerobic lagoon suddenly feeling like a choking gas. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. Someone was playing a deeply sick game, and they were escalating the threat rapidly. It was no longer a vague message. It was a personal invitation. I didn't burn this message. I took a picture of the drawing with my phone, wiped the image off the wall as best I could, and went home. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. This was psychological warfare, and it was working. The next morning, I showed the photo to Roy before Earl got in. Roy looked at the drawing of the wide-mouthed, tilted figure and just shook his head slowly. He's watching us, Dale. Whoever this is, they're here during the day, they know our schedule, and they're waiting for us to get rattled. We agreed to split up that day and try to find anything out of the ordinary, a broken fence wire, a discarded piece of evidence. I took the northern perimeter, walking the full length of the electric fence line. It was tedious work, but I was looking for anything that suggested a break-in. About a half-mile from the main complex, the fence ran along a particularly dense patch of woods. I noticed a small area where the thick undergrowth had been recently pressed down, leading to a small, nearly invisible break in the foliage right at the perimeter. It wasn't a hole, just a spot where the leaves had been parted, like someone had slipped through sideways. I knelt down and looked closer. There was a faint scent, not pig, not mud, but something acrid and strange, like stale sweat and cheap, overused cooking oil. As I studied the disturbed ground, I saw something shiny, glinting near a root. It was a small, crudely cut piece of aluminum foil, folded tightly. I picked it up and carefully unfolded it. Inside, nestled in the creases, was a tiny, perfectly formed ball of dark, cooked ground meat. It was the size of a marble, cold and hard. I immediately recognized it. It was a single, tiny, hand-rolled meatball, and I knew exactly where the meat had come from. Every week, we had to cull any sick or stillborn piglets. We took them to the rendering truck, but sometimes an older farmhand would discreetly bury a few of the very small ones. This was a deliberate, sickening mockery. The feast mentioned in the note was apparently being prepared with our own dead livestock. My stomach turned. I felt a surge of pure, cold panic. This person wasn't just a sick prankster. They were someone who was living among the refuse of the farm, watching us, and actively consuming its products in some deranged ritual. They weren't an outsider. They were fully integrated into the horrors of the farm environment. I called Roy immediately. "Get to the North Woods line, Roy. I found something. It's close to the old oak tree." I waited for Roy, staring into the dark line of the woods, my heart pounding a panicked rhythm against the silent backdrop of the farm. The noise of the distant pigs was suddenly louder, more frantic, like they knew something I didn't. Roy arrived a few minutes later, his face grim when I showed him the tiny meatball in the folded foil. "They're living out here, Dale. Sleeping in the woods, waiting. They're trying to drive us off. Or worse." As Roy was examining the spot, a sound caught my attention. It was the choked "way-I" again. It came from the dense trees, closer than before, maybe 50 feet inside the woods. It was undeniably the sound of a human throat trying to mimic a pig's desperate cry. And it was followed by a series of wet, rapid snuffling noises, the sound of an animal rooting through the dirt, or maybe a person with their face pressed to the wet leaves. We both froze, backs pressed against the electric fence line. The electric wire gave off a low, constant zzz sound that was suddenly incredibly loud. "That's it," Roy whispered, his face tight with fear. "We're done. We call Earl. We call the cops. We don't care about the consequences." We started backing away slowly, putting distance between ourselves and the woods. That's when we saw the pig. It was a young hog, maybe 150 pounds, one of the smaller ones we kept in the farrowing barns. It was standing at the edge of the woods, right where the ground was disturbed, staring at us. It shouldn't have been there. It was miles from the barns. It must have escaped the day before and wandered the fields. The hog looked healthy, but it wasn't moving. It was just standing perfectly still, its head low, its snout pointed at us, its eyes reflecting the weak daylight. Then, the pig started to make a sound. Not a squeal, not a grunt. It was a single, low sigh, a sound of resignation. As we watched in horror, the pig took 2 wobbly steps and then completely collapsed onto the dirt. It started shaking violently, not a convulsion, but a desperate, final tremble. And then, as if its internal wiring had simply been cut, it went silent. It was dead. Roy and I stood there, utterly paralyzed. The pig had been fine, walking, breathing, only to drop dead the moment it came out of the woods. We cautiously approached the body. There was no visible injury, no obvious blood. We had to roll the heavy carcass over to check its underside. And that's when we saw it. etched crudely into the soft, pink flesh of the pig's belly, using what looked like a rough, sharp stone, was a symbol. It was a simple, inverted triangle with a single, thick line drawn across the top, the geometric symbol for a shepherd's crook. The pig was the final delivered message. A literal sacrifice, marked with the same cryptic message from the first note. The shepherd had made their choice. We backed away quickly and called Earl. Earl, the overreactor, arrived in a cloud of dust, shotgun on his lap. He took one look at the marked pig, the folding in the woods, and the fear on our faces, and he didn't need any more convincing. "We're calling the state police," he said, his voice flat and deadly serious. "Someone is trying to run a ritual out here." The police arrived hours later. They were skeptical at first. A dead pig, a drawing on the wall, and some notes written in blood. They figured it was a local cult. They did a cursory search of the woods, but found nothing. The farm went quiet after that. Earl hired security, and we never found the person. But the psychological fear stayed with me. 2 weeks after the incident, I decided to quit. I couldn't stand the sight of the pigs anymore. As I was cleaning out my locker in the crew room, I found one last item. Tucked into the toe of my old work boot was a single, small, rolled-up note, written in the same blocky letters, but this time in clean, black ink. It was the final, chilling piece of the puzzle, and it confirmed my worst fears. "You're not as quiet as you think, Dale, but the noise is welcome. We saved the best part for you. Keep watching the pens." I knew what that meant. In the chaos of the pig pens, under the constant screaming, someone had been watching us, not just waiting in the woods, but living among the pigs, listening to our whispers, making notes about our actions. And they hadn't just saved the best part of the meat for me. They had saved the best fear for me. The fear of knowing that somewhere, one of the human figures who fed, cleaned, and managed the pigs was completely unhinged and still working there. I left that day, never looking back. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and I hear a car horn or a sudden, sharp noise, I still hear that unnatural, choked "whoa!" And I still wonder which one of my old coworkers eventually became the new shepherd, and what kind of ceremony they are running in the perpetual darkness and deafening noise of the hog farm. This story happened to me when I was still a teenager, around 1999, working on my grandfather's small dairy farm in upstate New York. It was a completely different world from the commercial operation. In the second story, this was a tiny, isolated, family-run place. My grandfather, old Mr. Hemlock, was the quintessential calm thinker. Everything was steady, predictable, and based on routines a century old. The farm was centered around an old, sprawling Victorian farmhouse, and the source of all our water was a deep, stone-lined well out behind the main milking parlor. This well was my private curiosity, the kind of forgotten, functional antique that a kid finds fascinating. It had a heavy, creaking iron cover and a concrete base, but the rope and bucket system was still operational. Grandpa would use it only for gardening, as the house had modern plumbing, but it was there. The trouble began on a clear, breezy afternoon in mid-July. I was weeding the vegetable patch near the well. I was alone, and the only sounds were the distant, mechanical rhythm of the milking machine in the parlor and the low moo of a cow from the pasture. I heard a sound coming from the well. It wasn't the wind whistling across the mouth of the stone. It was a faint, low-frequency hum. I walked over, placing my ear close to the heavy iron cover. I could hear it clearly now. It was a single, sustained, low C note. Not a musical note, but a resonant, deep tone, like the vibration of a thick wire being plucked. I lifted the iron cover just an inch. The sound immediately stopped. Dead silence. I waited a moment, slowly letting the heavy cover fall back into place with a dull thud. I listened again. Nothing. Must have been a weird acoustic echo or something in the deep shaft. I chalked it up to imagination and went back to the vegetables. But that night, the hum was back. I woke up around 2 a.m. The house was dead quiet. The hum was so faint it wasn't a sound you heard with your ears, but one you felt in your chest. It was vibrating through the floorboards, a slow, continuous voom. It was coming from outside, from the direction of the well. I got out of bed and crept to the window. The moon was nearly full, casting a stark, bluish light over the yard. The well was clearly visible. Nothing was moving. I stood there for 10 minutes, listening. The hum was steady, unwavering, and now I could finally hear it properly. It sounded like a massive, dormant electrical transformer running in the deep distance. But our farm didn't have a large transformer, just a small utility pole a quarter-mile away. I decided to check the area. I slipped out the back door, grabbed a small lamp from the porch, and walked toward the well. As I got closer, the hum intensified, vibrating through the grass under my sneakers. It felt like I was walking toward the source of a deep, focused energy. I reached the well. The hum was coming right out of the crack between the stone lip and the iron cover. It was so strong that when I placed my hand on the cold iron, I could feel the resonance through my palm. I slowly, carefully, lifted the iron cover completely off the well and set it silently on the concrete pad. The hum didn't change. It was coming straight up the shaft. I knelt down and shined the lamp into the black void. The light beam hit the water far below, turning the surface into a small, shimmering coin of silver. The well was deep over 80 feet. Then, from the water, the hum stopped. It was replaced by a sound that made the hair stand up on my arms. A wet, sucking slurp. It was the sound of a large, heavy object being slowly dragged out of the water. My heart hammered against my ribs. I froze, the lamp shaking violently in my hand. I couldn't move. I couldn't rationalize the sound. It was too clear, too physical. Then, a voice. It was a low, guttural whisper, magnified and distorted by the stone shaft, coming straight up from the blackness. It didn't say words. It was just a sound, a long, sibilant huss. It was the sound of someone trying to pull air into damaged, waterlogged lungs. But the most terrifying part was the echo. Every sound I made, every breath, every terrified gasp was immediately, perfectly echoed back to me from the well. My gasp became a sharp, mocking gasp. My shaky hand on the concrete became a perfect, rhythmic scrape. Scrape coming from below. I was trapped in a silent, nocturnal conversation with the darkness, and the other party was using my own sounds against me. The fear of being watched, of being heard, was compounded by the fact that I was being perfectly mimicked. I was being studied. I scrambled back, dropping the lamp, which thankfully landed on the concrete without breaking, still shining into the well. I stood up, trembling, and ran back to the house, slamming the kitchen door shut. I didn't call my grandfather. The calm thinker would have told me I was hearing things. I retreated to my room, listening. The humming was gone. The only sound was the familiar, heavy silence of the old farmhouse. I spent the next morning convinced I had dreamed it, or that the isolation had finally gotten to me. But later that day, Grandpa asked me a question that brought the panic rushing back. "Did you borrow the bucket, Mark?" he asked, pointing to the well. "It's gone." I walked over to the well with him. The iron cover was back in place where I'd left it, but the rope was dangling freely into the shaft. The heavy, metal-rimmed wooden bucket, which should have been secured to the rope, was gone. Grandpa, the ultimate realist, simply shrugged. Old rope probably snapped. Shame, that was a good bucket. He took out his utility knife and neatly cut the frayed rope, tying a loose knot at the end. "It's gone now. Forget about it. Nothing in that well but water and old stones." But I knew the rope hadn't snapped. The slurp I had heard was the sound of the bucket being pulled out of the water by something with immense, deliberate force. And that meant whatever was down there had taken a trophy. The loss of the bucket was a physical, irrefutable proof that I had not imagined the sound. Someone, or something, was down there, and it had the strength and intention to sever a heavy rope and keep the bucket. The next few days were excruciating. I couldn't stop thinking about the well. Every time I passed it, I felt a magnetic pull to check it, and a paralyzing fear of what I might find. I started avoiding the yard. I told myself that whatever had been down there had moved on, that it was a transient thing, a vagrant or a desperate animal. But the thought of the low hess was a persistent, chilling memory. 3 days later, the routine of the farm was shattered again. Grandpa had left for the feed store around 9 a.m. I was in the milking parlor, cleaning the hoses, when I heard a high-pitched, desperate whining. It wasn't a cow. It was our barn cat, a stray named Barnabas, who was usually unflappable. He was crying near the back door of the parlor, an aggressive, terrified sound. I walked over and opened the door. Barnabas was standing on the concrete apron, his back arched, his tail fluffed out, his ears pinned back, staring at something near the well. I looked where he was staring. On the concrete pads surrounding the well, right where I had dropped the lamp, was a perfect circle of something placed on the clean stone. It was our old, missing wooden bucket. I walked toward it slowly. The bucket was sitting upright, completely dry, with a single, crucial difference. It was no longer a perfect circle. A rough, jagged hole had been punched completely through the thick wooden base, as if hit by an incredible, focused force. I reached for it, hesitant, and as my fingers wrapped around the heavy, waterlogged wood, I felt something inside the bucket rattle. I lifted it, turning it over to look into the splintered hole. A small, dark object rolled out and dropped onto the concrete. It was a smooth, perfect, gray river stone. It was about the size of a golf ball, and it was still slightly damp. The surface was totally smooth, except for one detail. There was a small, perfectly round hole drilled clean through the center. I stood there, holding the stone and the bucket, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into a terrifying picture. Whatever was down there was not trapped. It had the strength to punch a hole through a thick wooden base, and the time, patience, and deliberate focus to bore a perfect hole through a river stone. This was not an animal. This was not a vagrant. This was an intelligent, focused, deeply disturbing presence. The gift was an invitation, a piece of artwork, and a demonstration of power all at once. I dropped the bucket in the stone and ran back toward the milking parlor. Barnabas, the overreactor in our scene, was already gone, bolted into the hayloft. I grabbed the phone, my hands shaking, and called the one person I thought would understand. My mother, who lived an hour away. I tried to tell her the whole story, the hum, the slurp, the echo, the bucket. I was rambling, hysterical, not the calm thinker Grandpa would want me to be. "Mark, slow down. A noise? You found a bucket? It was a prank, sweetie. You're on a remote farm, you're bored. Just go inside and wait for Grandpa to get back." She was trying to be the skeptic, the voice of reason. I hung up, defeated. No one would believe me. The fear, the loneliness, and the realization that I was the only witness made me feel completely trapped. I walked back to the well, intending to throw the bucket back down and cover the lid, to try and erase the whole memory. As I reached the stone lip, I saw something that made me freeze for a third time. Drawn onto the wet concrete with what looked like the runoff from the damp bucket were two small, faint marks. They were faint lines, almost like pencil marks, but they were perfectly parallel, and they were the length and width of my thumb. It was a crude but unmistakable drawing of the hole in the bucket, and next to the drawing, written in the same damp-looking material, was a single, tiny block letter M. My initial was the final confirmation. I had been identified. The thing in the well knew I had been the one to lift the cover. It was no longer a general threat to the farm. It was a psychological operation aimed squarely at me. The fear of being watched had turned into the terror of being personally selected. I stood there, staring at the small, damp M, feeling the weight of the endless, silent cornfields around me. That's when I heard the hum again. It was the same low, insistent boom, but this time it was coming from the side of the house, right underneath the windows of my bedroom. It was closer than before, and it was moving. I didn't run. I stood my ground, my eyes locked on the well, and watched as a patch of dirt near the side of the house began to move. It wasn't a visible figure, but the ground itself was shifting. A long, slow, serpentine ripple was moving across the flower bed, disturbing the soil as if something massive and completely underground was pushing its way through the earth. The humming was now a physical force, vibrating the soil. The ripple moved from the flower bed, across the small strip of grass, and stopped directly underneath my bedroom window. The humming stopped. Total, agonizing silence. Then, the window of my bedroom, the one I had just been leaning out of, let out a single, clear, sharp tink. I stared at the window, 100 feet away. Nothing was visible, but a small, spiderweb crack had appeared in the bottom pane of the glass. It was a warning. It wasn't just in the well anymore. It was in the earth, and it was capable of getting closer. It was telling me, without a word, that the depth of the well was no defense, and the walls of the house were no barrier. I never told Grandpa about the M or the cracked window. I made up an excuse about breaking a hockey puck on the glass and paid for it myself. I left the farm the next day, claiming I needed to go back home early to prepare for the school year. But I never forgot the well. I still can't stand being near cisterns or open pipes. And every now and then, late at night, when the house is quiet and the refrigerator hums a certain low frequency, I feel that familiar, low C-note vibration in my chest. It's the persistent fear, the psychological horror of knowing that in the silent, hidden world beneath our feet, a patient, intelligent madness is waiting. And I know, deep down, that the well is still there, still waiting for someone to lift the cover and start the conversation again. And I still wonder what it had in mind for M.